he started stabbing her. I think Brendan shot him, and he asked me help to shot him too because...
It's okay.
It was on a Friday morning in Herndon, Virginia, February 24th, 2023. At exactly 7:42 a.m., dispatchers in Fairfax County took an emergency call from that address. The voice on the line belongs to a man. He's frantic, but there's something underneath the panic the dispatcher can't quite place, a flatness that doesn't match the words coming out of his mouth. He says a man broke into his home. He says that man attacked his wife. He says he shot him. Patrol cars are already rolling before he finishes the sentence. When officers arrive, they find a scene that will haunt this neighborhood for years. In the primary bedroom, a woman lies in the bed, bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Nearby, on the floor by a dog bed in the corner, a man lies motionless, shot several times. And kneeling over the woman, one hand pressed to her throat, is her husband. He isn't shouting for help. He isn't sobbing. Detective Thomas Goodell, one of the first homicide investigators on scene, will later describe it in stark terms. The man showed almost no visible emotion for someone who claims to have just watched his wife nearly murdered in front of him. The woman is rushed to a nearby hospital. She won't survive. Her name is Brendan Banfield. She's 37 years old. She spent her career keeping other people's children alive in intensive care units. And in the span of a single morning, in her own bedroom, no one was able to save her. The man on the floor is identified as Joseph Ryan, 38, of nearby Springfield. He's pronounced dead at the scene. And the man who called 911, the man detectives find with blood on his hands, is Brendan Banfield, Christine's husband, an IRS Special Agent trained to build cases against other people for a living. Downstairs, in the basement, officers find something else. The couple's 4-year-old daughter, physically unharmed, with no idea her mother is dying 2 floors above her. At first glance, this looks like something detectives have seen before. A home invasion gone catastrophically wrong. A husband finds a stranger attacking his wife and does what almost anyone would. He protects her, he uses force, he kills the intruder trying to save the person he loves. That's the story Brendan Banfield tells the dispatcher. It's the story he'll keep telling, in one form or another, for the next 3 years. It isn't what happened. If you're new here, hit subscribe. Every week on the Homicide Room, we take you inside real cases where the killer walked among the people who trusted them most. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from tonight? Now, let's go back to that Friday morning, and the last few normal hours this family would ever have. To understand how this Friday morning became a double homicide, you have to go back nearly 2 decades, to a college campus in Connecticut and 2 18-year-olds with no idea what their lives would become. Brendan Banfield grew up in New York. He met Christine as a freshman at Quinnipiac University, and the two became the kind of college couple everyone assumes will make it. Inseparable, early, serious, young. What followed was nearly 20 years together. Marriage, a move south to Virginia for work, and a life that looked, from the outside, entirely intact. Christine built her career around caring for others. She worked as a pediatric intensive care unit nurse, one of the hardest, most emotionally demanding jobs in medicine, and also trained as a sexual assault nurse examiner, treating victims of violence with both clinical precision and enormous compassion. Family would later describe her as kind, reliable, and selfless. Her older sister, Danielle Hawker, would eventually stand in a courtroom and describe growing up beside her, chasing fireflies together, sleeping side by side in sleeping bags. When she was born, Danielle said, "I became we." Brendan's path took him somewhere very different. He became a special agent for the IRS, trained in investigations, financial crime, and the procedural discipline of building a case that survives scrutiny in court. It's one of the darker ironies here. The man who would eventually stage a crime scene and coach a co-conspirator's testimony spent his career on the opposite side of that exact process. By 2021, the Banfields were settled in Herndon, a suburb roughly 30 miles outside Washington, D.C., raising their young daughter. Like a lot of dual-income families, they needed help with full-time childcare. That October, they brought a live-in au pair into the house through a placement agency. a young woman from Brazil named Juliana Magalhães in her early 20s, tasked with caring for their toddler in a country where she had no family of her own. There was nothing unusual about that arrangement, at least at first. It's one repeated in households across the country every year. Nobody involved, not Christine, not the extended family, not the agency, had any reason to think it would end in 2 deaths. The neighborhood itself isn't a house tucked away somewhere isolated. It's a cul-de-sac lined with 2-story homes and basketball hoops in the driveways, minutes from the office parks of Reston, close enough to Washington for a punishing daily commute, but far enough to feel like a separate world entirely. Neighbors here know each other's names. Kids ride bikes between yards. It's the kind of street where nothing is supposed to happen, which is exactly why what did happen there landed with such force once it became public. By every outward measure, the Banfields fit that landscape without friction. 2 steady incomes were enough to keep them comfortably inside the neighborhood's rhythm. Youth activities on weekends, a house with room to grow into, a family that looked, in every school photo and every driveway conversation, exactly like it was supposed to. That surface stability is part of what makes this case so difficult for the people who actually knew them. There was no public unraveling. No warning anyone could point back to. Just a family that appeared, right up until the morning of February 24th, entirely intact. An au pair arrangement, meanwhile, depends on an enormous amount of trust running in every direction at once. The family trusts the placement agency's vetting. The au pair trusts the family to treat her fairly in a country not her own. And in a live-in setup especially, the line between employee and member of the household tends to blur fast, often in perfectly healthy ways, through shared meals and shared holidays, and a real fondness that grows between a caregiver and the child in her care. In the Banfield household, that blurred line went somewhere far darker. For the first year or so, Juliana's presence in the household looked unremarkable, present for breakfasts, school drop-offs, the ordinary rhythms of raising a small child. That changed in August 2022. According to prosecutors, it was during this stretch, while Christine was visiting her parents in New York, that Brendan began a romantic and sexual relationship with the young woman living under his roof. The imbalance here is worth sitting with. Juliana wasn't a coworker or an old friend reconnected online. She was a young employee, living inside the family home, financially dependent on the Banfields in a country not her own, involved now with a man nearly 20 years older who held significant power over her life in the U.S. For a while, the affair ran in parallel to ordinary domestic life, with the household still functioning on the surface. But something shifted that fall. By October 2022, court filings say Brendan had begun telling people close to the situation that he wanted to be rid of his wife. Not divorced, not separated, rid of her. Investigators would later point to that phrase as the real starting point of everything that followed. For most people in Brendan's position, divorce would have been the obvious next step. Painful, expensive, but ultimately survivable, and nowhere close to criminal. Prosecutors argued Brendan wasn't willing to pay that price. The first cost was financial. Untangling nearly 2 decades of shared assets and income could have left him worse off than before. The second, and more central, was his daughter. Divorce meant sharing custody with Christine, splitting the unilateral authority he currently held as a married father in an intact household. Underneath both was something prosecutors returned to again and again at trial: control. Not the loss of Christine as a partner, but the loss of authority over the shape of his own life. At sentencing, Danielle Hawker put it directly to Brendan in court. He could have divorced and moved on, but divorce would have required relinquishing control, and control was always the priority. His actions were not driven by love, but a desire for power, deception, and a complete disregard for the lives he destroyed. There was also Juliana. She would later testify that Brendan told her he wanted to marry her and start a family with her, but that he needed his wife out of the picture first. By the fall of 2022, investigators say he'd landed on a plan that let him keep the money, keep full custody of his daughter, and start a new relationship, without ever filing for divorce, and without giving Christine the chance to fight for any of it. The plan didn't just require Christine to die. It required someone else to take the blame. What prosecutors describe next is an unusually calculated, months-long plot. At its center was FetLife, an online platform built around fetish and alternative sexuality communities. Prosecutors say Brendan and Juliana created a fake profile there using Christine's identity, her name, her photos, presenting her as a woman interested in a specific, violent-sounding fantasy, a staged home invasion involving restraint and a mock assault. Using that fabricated account, they found a man willing to act it out, Joseph Ryan, 38, of Springfield. Ryan had no connection to the Banfields whatsoever. As far as he knew, he was corresponding with a married woman exploring a fantasy behind her husband's back. Someone interested in role play, not someone real named Christine, who had no idea any of this correspondence existed. In the days before the murders, prosecutors say Brendan directed Juliana to move the conversation onto Telegram, an encrypted messaging app, to lock in the details and confirm Ryan's consent. The instructions given to him, believing they came from Christine, were explicit. Come upstairs, cut off the clothing, tie her up, carry out the scenario. Ryan had no idea he was reading a script written by two other people, or that the woman he thought he was meeting didn't exist. He believed he was walking into a private, consensual encounter. He was walking into a trap built to end with him dead and blamed for a murder he had nothing to do with. Beyond what came out at trial, little is publicly known about Ryan's own life. But by every account, he was an ordinary man with no history of violence, selected for one reason only. He was willing to answer an ad that wasn't real. It's worth pausing on him for a moment, because in most retellings of cases like this one, the person cast as the stranger tends to disappear into that role entirely, reduced to a plot device rather than remembered as a person. Ryan had a life of his own, entirely separate from the Banfields, right up until a fabricated online identity pulled him into their orbit. He didn't know Christine. He didn't know Brendan. As far as the record shows, he was simply exploring a corner of the internet built around consensual roleplay. A legal, if unconventional, interest shared by plenty of people who go their whole lives without coming to any harm because of it. What he stepped into instead was a plan built specifically to use his own consent against him. Every reassurance he received, every detail about the encounter he believed he'd agreed to, had been crafted by two people he'd never met, using a stolen identity belonging to a woman who had no idea any of it was happening. His family would spend years afterward fighting to correct the record, insisting the world understand that he wasn't a home invader or a predator, but a man who'd been lied to, lured, and killed to protect someone else's secret. On the morning of the murders, the last pieces fell into place. Prosecutors say Brendan turned off Christine's phone and hid it in a kitchen drawer, cutting off any chance she could call for help. Then he left the house and drove to a nearby McDonald's, close enough to control the timing, far enough to claim later he hadn't been home when the attack happened. There's something chilling about the geography of it, walked through step by step. A man moving through his own home with the calm, procedural mindset of someone executing a plan rather than living a life. No panic, no hesitation. Every action deliberate, the opposite of how anyone behaves when they're genuinely blindsided by tragedy. Joseph Ryan arrived believing he was stepping into a prearranged encounter. According to testimony, Christine was stabbed by her husband. Ryan was shot by Juliana, using a firearm Brendan had bought months earlier and personally trained her to use at a local range. Then, prosecutors allege, the two of them staged the room to tell a different story entirely. A stranger breaking in, attacking Christine, shot by her husband in a desperate act of self-defense. Brendan called 911 at 7:42 a.m. By the time officers arrived, the story was already set. It would take investigators nearly 3 years to fully take it apart. In the immediate aftermath, Fairfax County Police Chief Kevin Davis and his detectives were working with Brendan's account, a stranger, already attacking his wife, shot in self-defense. It's worth understanding why that held up, at least initially. There was no obvious motive on the surface. Brendan was a federal officer with a clean record. Christine had no known enemies. The scene contained the raw components of a home invasion. An unfamiliar man, dead, in the bedroom of a woman who'd been attacked. But small details quickly complicated it. There was no forced entry anywhere in the house. No broken window, no damaged door frame. If Ryan had really broken in to commit a violent assault, He'd done it without leaving a single mark on the property. The blood evidence didn't fit cleanly either. In a genuine struggle to save someone, spatter tends to follow a chaotic, close-quarters pattern between two people meeting violence for the first time. What investigators found instead was more consistent with the idea that the attack on Christine had already been carried out before any confrontation with Ryan took place, and Ryan's body, found off to the side near the dog bed rather than near the woman he was supposedly attacking, only reinforced that red. And then there was Brendan's flat, unaffected demeanor at the scene, a detail experienced homicide investigators learned not to dismiss. Within months, the investigation had shifted. This was no longer a question of identifying an intruder's background. It was a question of whether the intruder story held together at all. Crime scenes tend to tell the truth whether the people involved want them to or not. Blood doesn't fall the way people expect it to, and it doesn't forget. In a genuine break-in, a stranger forcing his way into a house and attacking a woman while her husband fights him off, the physical evidence tends to follow a fairly predictable shape. Signs of struggle near an entry point, wounds consistent with someone actively defending herself against an unknown attacker, spatter reflecting chaotic, close-quarters violence between two people who'd never shared a room before. None of that lined up cleanly here. Investigators kept coming back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Whatever had happened in that bedroom hadn't unfolded the way Brendan said it had. The break that reshaped the case came nearly 8 months after the murders. In October 2023, detectives returned to the Herndon house, still an active crime scene, and walked back up to the bedroom where Christine had died. On the nightstand, they found a framed photograph. Brendan, smiling, arm around a young woman. Not Christine. Juliana Magalhães. A photo like that, left in plain view in the room where a wife was murdered, isn't proof of a killing by itself. But it's proof of a hidden relationship nobody had known about. And once investigators understood that Brendan and the family's live-in au pair had been involved, an entirely new set of questions opened up about motive and about what Juliana might have known or done that morning. That same month, Fairfax County authorities arrested her. She was charged with second-degree murder and a firearm offense and held without bond to await trial. Brendan, notably, wasn't arrested. He remained free for nearly another full year while the investigation kept building around him. Before we get into what finally broke this case open, it's worth pausing on how close it came to never being told this way at all. If that photograph had been tucked away somewhere less obvious, if Juliana had never agreed to cooperate, if the forensic details had lined up just slightly differently, this could have gone down in Fairfax County history as an unfortunate but understandable tragedy, with Joseph Ryan remembered, if at all, as a violent stranger who got what he deserved. That's exactly why we make this show. Not just to walk through what happened, but how narrowly the truth managed to surface at all. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know which detail in this one caught you most off guard. Now, back to the investigation. Behind the scenes during those 8 months, investigators had been working through the layers of evidence that any modern homicide case depends on: phone records, message histories, gun purchase records. They traced the FetLife account back toward its real owners rather than the identity it had projected. They pulled range records tied to Brendan's firearm. None of it alone was enough to bring charges. It was the accumulation, together with the photograph, that finally gave investigators the confidence to move. What ultimately broke the case wide open, though, was Juliana's decision to cooperate. Facing a second-degree murder charge and decades in prison, she agreed roughly a year after her arrest to plead guilty to a lesser charge: involuntary manslaughter. In exchange for testifying against Brendan and laying out, in her own words, exactly what had happened. It's worth being careful about how to weigh her role. She wasn't the architect of this plan. By every account, including her own, that was Brendan, a man nearly 2 decades older, in a position of real power over her life in the U.S. But she also wasn't a bystander. She helped build the fake identity used to lure Ryan to his death. She pulled a trigger. She sat outside in a car with a 4-year-old child while the plan she'd helped construct played out inside the house. In September 2024, 19 months after the murders, Brendan Banfield was finally arrested, facing 4 counts of aggravated murder, a firearm charge, and child endangerment tied to his daughter's presence in the home. He pleaded not guilty and held that plea through trial. That 19-month gap is worth sitting with. For nearly a year and a half, the man prosecutors would eventually call the architect of the entire plot remained free, continuing his life, retaining a role in raising the daughter he and Christine had shared, appearing to the outside world as simply a grieving widower whose wife's killer had already been dealt with. It's a reminder of how homicide investigations actually work, in contrast to how they're often portrayed on screen. Prosecutors don't move the moment they have suspicion. They wait until they have a case strong enough to survive a defense attorney's best efforts to dismantle it in front of a jury. In a case this layered, involving digital forensics, a cooperating witness, and a defendant with law enforcement training of his own, that meant building slowly for the better part of 2 years. Jury selection began in mid-January 2026 in Fairfax County Circuit Court. 9 men and 7 women were seated to hear a case prosecutors said involved a lot of salacious details, but was ultimately, in their words, about 2 neighbors who'd been murdered. Opening statements set the tone. Chief Deputy Commonwealth's Attorney Jenna Sands laid out a timeline stretching back to August 2022, arguing that everything that happened that February morning was the final step of a plan built over half a year, that Brendan hadn't failed to stop a home invasion, he'd manufactured one, using his own wife's stolen identity and a stranger's trust as raw material. Defense attorney John Carroll pushed a different framing entirely, undermined the credibility of the prosecution's key witness. Juliana, he reminded jurors, had every incentive to shape her account to avoid a life sentence, and had reportedly met with television producers about a documentary. He pointed to physical evidence that had never been sent for DNA testing, arguing investigators had built their case around a conclusion they'd already reached rather than following the evidence wherever it led. Jurors heard from crime scene investigators who walked through the bedroom in detail, the positioning of both bodies, the wound patterns, the blood spatter that prosecutors argued contradicted Brendan's account. They heard from digital forensics experts who traced the FetLife profile and telegram messages back to devices connected to Brendan and Juliana, establishing the technical backbone of the scheme in granular, difficult-to-dispute terms. It's a case worth understanding as a study in patience as much as anything else, because no single piece of evidence convicted Brendan Banfield. It was the accumulation of dozens of smaller threads, gathered over nearly 3 years, that eventually became impossible for a jury to look past. The absence of forced entry, the inconsistent spatter, the traced FetLife account, the framed photo on the nightstand, the range visits, the encrypted messages, and finally, direct testimony from someone who'd actually been in that room. Any one of those pieces standing alone might have been explainable away. A skilled defense attorney can create doubt around almost any individual piece of forensic evidence. What's far harder to do is create doubt around all of them at once, each pointing in the same direction, each corroborating the next. Then, roughly 3 weeks in, Juliana took the stand herself, the emotional and evidentiary center of the trial. She described how the affair began in August 2022 and the months that followed inside the same house where Christine slept, unaware. She testified that Brendan wanted to marry her and start a family, but needed his wife gone first. She walked jurors through the planning, the fake profile, the shift to telegram, the range sessions, the gun he handed her that morning, and through the killing itself, waiting outside with the couple's daughter, following Ryan into the house and up the stairs, firing a second shot at him with Brendan's personal firearm after he'd already been struck. It was devastating testimony, both for what it revealed about the murders and for what it revealed about a young woman who'd spent years insisting, at least publicly, that she'd been pulled into someone else's plan rather than helping build her own. Whether the jury believed every part of that framing is impossible to know. What's clear is they believed enough of it to convict the man she named as the architect. Under cross-examination, the defense worked to paint her as an unreliable narrator with every reason to shade the truth in her own favor. A plea deal already secured, a reduced sentence riding on how convincingly she could implicate her former lover, reported conversations with television producers interested in her story. It's a familiar tension in cases built around cooperating witnesses. The same deal that makes someone willing to testify honestly is also the deal a defense team can point to as a motive to lie. Jurors were left to weigh her account not in isolation, but against everything else. The forensic evidence, the digital trail, the framed photograph. all of which happened to line up with what she was telling them. Brendan's decision to testify in his own defense may be the single most consequential choice of the trial. Defendants aren't required to take the stand, and defense attorneys often advise against it. Every word becomes fair game on cross-examination. He testified anyway for roughly 2 days. He didn't deny the affair, or that both he and Christine had strayed from each other at points across nearly 20 years together. An attempt, it seemed, to frame infidelity as an unremarkable feature of a long marriage rather than evidence of a hidden double life building toward violence. But on the central question, he was unequivocal. "I think that it's an absurd line of questioning," he told the courtroom, "for something that is not serious, that a plan was made to get rid of my wife. That is absolutely crazy." He held to his original account. He'd come home to find Ryan attacking Christine, identified himself as law enforcement, and shot him to protect her. It didn't hold up. Sands later told reporters his testimony did his case more harm than good. Cold, unconvincing, missing the emotional register jurors would expect from an innocent man describing the worst morning of his life. The jury began deliberating on a Friday, working for hours without reaching a decision. They returned Monday, spending roughly 9 more hours before finally reaching one. Just after 5 p.m., the 4 persons stood to deliberate. Guilty on 2 counts of aggravated murder for both Christine and Joseph Ryan, along with a firearm charge and child endangerment. Because of the aggravated murder convictions, the sentence was effectively decided the moment the verdict was read. Brendan would spend the rest of his life in prison. Outside the courthouse, prosecutor Steve Descano addressed reporters. There were obviously a lot of salacious details in this case that caused it to get a lot of attention, he said. But at the end of the day, this case is about 2 people, 2 neighbors of ours that were murdered almost 3 years ago here in Fairfax County. We take that very, very seriously. Sentencing came months later, in June 2026. No verdict, however definitive, actually closes a wound like this one, and the statements that day made that painfully clear. Danielle Hawker spoke about who her sister had been before any of this: kind, caring, selfless. She told Brendan directly that their daughter would eventually have to reckon with the fact that her own father had put her in harm's way, that his choices, dressed up as self-defense for years, had never been about protecting anyone but himself. Joseph Ryan's family spoke too. His aunt, Sangeeta Ryan, said Brendan hadn't just taken Joe and Christine from the people who loved them. He tried to erase the truth of who they actually were, rewriting both of their final moments into a story that served only him. His mother, Deirdre Fisher, appeared virtually, unable to be there in person. Judge Azcarate was unmoved by any argument for leniency, citing Brendan's continued lack of remorse as she imposed the mandatory life sentence without hesitation. Life sentences carry a kind of finality that can feel almost anticlimactic after the drawn-out drama of a trial. There's no appeal likely to meaningfully change the outcome for a man convicted on this much evidence, no parole hearing on the horizon offering any realistic path to release. Brendan will, barring some extraordinary development, die in prison. But for the families left behind, a sentence like that rarely functions as closure so much as confirmation. An official, courtroom-stamped acknowledgement that the story the world had been telling itself for years about a heroic husband who tried and failed to save his wife from a home invader was a lie from the very beginning. Juliana Magalhães received a 10-year sentence for manslaughter, a significant reduction from the second-degree murder charge she originally faced, in recognition of the testimony that ultimately dismantled Brendan's version of events and secured his conviction. It's a resolution that leaves some observers uneasy, given her own active role in Ryan's death. But without her decision to cooperate, there's a real possibility this case never reaches a courtroom at all, and Brendan Banfield spends the rest of his life free. It's tempting to file a case like this one under a familiar label, a love triangle gone wrong, a crime of passion, the kind of tabloid shorthand that makes for an easy headline. Sitting with the actual details, though, passion feels like the wrong word entirely. Passion is chaotic. It's impulsive. It doesn't spend 6 months building a fake online identity, training a co-conspirator at a gun range, coordinating an alibi, and hiding a wife's phone in a kitchen drawer to make sure she can't call for help. What happened in that house wasn't a marriage collapsing in a single violent moment. It was a marriage that one person had already quietly decided to end in the most permanent way possible, long before anyone else involved had any idea a decision had been made at all. That's the detail that tends to stay with people longest. Not the fetish website, not the au pair, not even the staged crime scene, but the sheer amount of ordinary time that passed while Brendan lived alongside his wife, functioning as her husband in every visible way, while quietly building the framework for her death underneath it. Family dinners continued. School pickups continued. Nights in the same bed continued. None of it changed on the surface while a plan moved forward beneath it. For investigators, cases like this tend to be harder to sit with than the ones involving obvious rage or a sudden loss of control. There's something more unsettling about a person who can maintain total normalcy for months at a stretch, sitting across the table from someone he's already decided to kill, than there is about someone who lashes out in a single moment he can't take back. It's also, unfortunately, a pattern that shows up more than people might expect in domestic homicide cases. Someone convinced that divorce is too costly, too public, too much of a loss of control, who talks themselves into believing violence is somehow the cleaner option. It never actually is. It just trades one kind of loss for a far greater one. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the violence of that February morning. It's how long the story held up, not just to the public, but to the earliest stages of a serious homicide investigation told by a man who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what detectives look for and how a narrative needs to hang together to survive contact with the truth. It took a framed photograph, left carelessly on a nightstand, to start pulling that story apart. It took one of his two co-conspirators deciding the truth was worth more than her silence. And it took a jury, 3 years later, finally saying out loud what the evidence had been pointing toward from the start. There was no intruder and no self-defense. There was a husband who decided, months in advance, that the easiest way out of his marriage wasn't a courtroom. It was a staged bedroom, made to look like the opposite of what it actually was. Christine Banfield spent her career keeping other people's children alive. Joseph Ryan walked into a house believing he was part of someone else's private fantasy, with no idea he'd been cast as the fall guy in his own murder. Neither of them ever stood a chance against a plan that had been building, quietly, for months before either of them knew it existed. For 8 months, the world believed Ryan was a violent stranger who got what he deserved. For nearly 3 years, Brendan walked through the world as a grieving widower, accepting condolences for a tragedy he'd engineered himself. Every version of that story protected the person who least deserved it and vilified the person who deserved it least of all, until investigators refused to stop pulling the thread. If this case affected you, if any part of Christine or Joseph's story stayed with you, let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Homicide Room, because every case we cover starts exactly like this one, with a story that isn't the truth and a room that eventually gives it up anyway.